It's great to be here. I'm going to do a few things this morning. I'm going to start off by saying a little bit about my organisation, what we do. I'm then going to talk about the voluntary sector and the SDGs. I'm then going to give you a wee bit of data around the environment in Northern Ireland and about climate. And I'm then going to finish up with a little bit of chat around environment, communities, and some opportunities. Okay, so Northern Ireland Environment Link. We are the membership body for the environment sector in Northern Ireland. These are our objectives, hopefully you can see there, to advance and promote environmental conservation, protection, improvement, raise awareness about environmental issues, provide a forum for exchange of ideas and to promote a collective voice. That's really, really important for our sector. And a lot of this is with the aim of influencing public policy. That slide then shows you the sort of diversity of the NEIL membership. So it's pretty diverse. We've got around 70 organisational members. And as you can see from this, they're not just purely environmental organisations. They include groups like Development Trusts NI, Hollywell Trust, Belfast Civic Trust, Belfast Healthy Cities, as well as the sort of environmental organisations you might expect. Also Wildlife National Trust, and so on. So a really diverse group of organisations trying to work together. The other thing we do at Link is we've got British Isles-wide connections. So there are environment links also in England, Scotland and Wales. We work with the Irish Environment Network in the south and other international organisations. So it's a pretty broad network. Okay, so I'm going to start really by saying a little bit about the voluntary sector and the SDGs. Okay, so I'm going to go back a couple of years to sort of 2018, 2019, and to some work that was being led by NICFA. NICFA pulled together a working group, and we met up a few times. We met with the department. We got some feedback about the SDGs and how they were being monitored. But one of the things that NICFA did was a little survey, and I think some of the headlines from it are quite interesting. So, some of the things that NICFA found from their survey of their membership. 52% of organisations were aware of the SDGs. 20% felt that the SDGs were very important to their organisation. 41% said that they would consider undertaking more work to create more alignment. I think the most interesting stat is this one. 70% of organisations were unintentionally aligning to the SDGs. So the work that they were doing was linked in already. The SDGs that were of most relevance: health and well-being, reduced inequalities, and gender equality. So NICFA said at the time, significant work is needed to increase awareness, but SDGs, in essence, are closely aligned with the values and aims of the voluntary sector. And I think that's really important. And I think that's something I'm probably going to finish with as well. But for one subsector of the voluntary sector, I suppose, the SDGs are really important, and that's my sector, it's the environment sector. Okay, so the slide you can see there is obviously the 17 SDGs. They cover all kinds of different things. The SDGs are important to the environment sector for two main reasons. Firstly, they represent an approach to development which is sustainable, obviously. They represent an approach which means that we will have development, but not at the cost of the environment itself. It's very easy to have economic development at any cost. So that's one of the key things that the environment sector obviously doesn't want. At this moment in time, we're basically using up 2 Earths. So in terms of our consumption as humans on the planet, we are using 2 Earths, and we've obviously only got one. The second important element of the SDGs is the cross-sectoral nature of these. And it's because the SDGs don't just cover environmental issues, they cover a whole range of other things. And these are really important to the environment sector and to NEIL members. And this slide just gives you a kind of snapshot of some of the work that the environment sector actually does. So the environmental sector organisations obviously are working in things like water and biodiversity and climate, but there's a whole range of other things as well. We want the people in Northern Ireland to have the best quality of life possible, and the way to do that is to improve our environment. And I think a way of looking at this is through this very, very simple slide. So this sort of represents how the environment sector see the world fitting together. You can see the three key elements: economy, society, and environment. And environment underpins everything. So we need to have a healthy environment for all of the other things to work. And I think a good example of this is the manifesto that we wrote for the sector back in earlier in 2022. We wrote this in the lead up to the Assembly elections, and we came up with 22 priorities across society. And they were presented under three main themes: nature and environment, climate and economy, people and well-being. And those manifesto asks cover a range of things. Obviously, environmental governance, freshwater, biodiversity, but also things like historic environment, education, SDGs, and many more. And I think this shows how the work of the sector interlinks with the wider voluntary sector. And I think it's worth noting just a little bit then about the SDGs and the programme for government. So one of the Neil Manifesto asks was for the full implementation of the SDGs, with annual progress reports, assessment and implementation. And the programme for government itself made a couple of interesting comments, and the SDGs are kind of a framework which the rest of the PFG is set in. So the PFG says, our health and well-being are directly affected by the quality of our environment. It is vitally important that we protect and enrich our natural environment. Achieving economic growth at the expense of our environment through degradation of finite resources is not sustainable. It goes on to say, the intention is that the outcomes framework will be our way to demonstrate progress towards the achievement of the SDGs. Okay, so if we're saying that the environment's going to be really important for delivering all these things for society, let's have a look to see what sort of state our environment is in. Anybody want to have a guess? Any initial thoughts on how we're doing? Takers? I heard someone say not great. It's mixed. It's a mixed bag, and the government department themselves, DERA, would also say it's a mixed bag. So let's see where we are. Okay, so these are fairly random slides, to be honest with you. This just shows you a bit of a snapshot across different areas to see how we're doing. This first slide is about level of concern. So how concerned are people with the environment? This shows you that about 80% of the population in Northern Ireland are at least fairly concerned. You can see that it has been increasing in recent years, so that's good. Obviously, we would like to increase it. Biodiversity. So this won't be a surprise, this is a problem. This slide is basically showing you two things. If you look at this slide on the right, it shows you the condition of our most precious places, the places that are most important for our environment. So the dark blue line is land-based sites. That shows you that about 14% of land-based sites are in favourable condition. The light blue line is marine. That shows you that less than 5% are in favourable condition. So biodiversity is a problem, not just here, worldwide. Freshwater. So we're an island at the edge of Europe. We should have good water quality. This is showing you that only about 30% of our freshwater is in good condition. So again, it's a really grim indicator. Something a bit more promising is recycling rates. So this shows you that in around 2004-05, recycling of waste, household waste, was around 25%. That's now up to almost 50%. So one of the areas that we're doing a bit better on. Transport. So this slide is looking at the percentage of journeys which are either done by walking or by public transport. And it shows you that from the starting point of measurement, which is around 2003, it was at 25%. It's still at 25%. So we're not really being able to increase that kind of that active travel. Two slides here. The picture on the left is showing that good news. Most scheduled monuments, 75% of scheduled monuments, are in pretty good condition. But the one on the right then is looking at buildings at risk. So that's showing us that the number of buildings and buildings at risk register has increased from around 340 up until about 570. And all you need to do is walk around Belfast city centre and you will see a whole load of buildings at risk. I've then got just a couple of things around the pandemic and reactions to the pandemic and how people felt about the environment. RSPB did some research. They found that 76% of people felt that nature had been an important source of comfort. 81% felt that visiting nature had made them happier. Outdoor recreation would do a lot of work in terms of creating paths and walks. 84% felt physical health benefits from being outdoors. 90% reported benefits related to mental health and well-being from being active in a natural environment. Just a few other considerations in. So overall, Northern Ireland, we're not doing brilliant in terms of the environment. I think that's obvious. We have one of the lowest levels of forest cover in Europe. Nature itself is under huge pressure. That's not just here, that's worldwide. We are one of the few countries that doesn't have an independent environmental protection agency. And the last one there, children's connection with nature is reducing. That's one of the most worrying things out of the whole presentation. Now, I don't really have data for that. All I've got is the anecdotal data from the 1960s, but we know the kids just aren't as engaged with the natural environment as they were years ago. Okay, so that's the environment. A bit on climate change, which is SDG 13. So very simple first slide. This just basically shows you how the climate is changing. It's showing you the average global surface temperature, and it basically shows you that over a very, very long period of time, it was pretty sort of static, and over the last 150 years, it's increased by almost 1.5 degrees. What's the cause of this? So the experts, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change say it is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change, making extreme climate events, including heat waves, heavy rainfall and droughts, more frequent and severe. Now, people will quite often say, well, 1.5 degrees, that's not much, is it? What difference does 1.5 degrees make? This slide tries to show that whenever you take the average, it has a big impact. It has a big impact across the globe. But the other thing I would say just to remember is the difference between now and the full extent of the last ice age was only about 6 degrees. Okay, so there's only about 6 degrees between now and the full extent of the ice age. So, a 1.5 degree heat in just over a century is pretty extreme. So what are the impacts? How are people in Northern Ireland going to feel these things in the future? Okay, so these are predictions. We don't know. This is our best guess. So flooding and rainfall. So there's around 45,000 houses in Northern Ireland at risk of flood. And we know that floods happen almost every year, and they're probably increasing in severity. But 45,000 houses at risk. Sea level rise. This slide is showing different scenarios depending on what we do with our CO2 emissions. If we don't get it right, we'll end up with almost a meter worth of sea level rise. So that's going to impact, thousands of properties around the coast. But the real problem there is that whenever you get severe weather events, it's going to have a massive impact. Heat. So what this slide basically shows is that we're just in for far more days of wet, really warm weather, far more days over 30 degrees and for longer periods of time, and a whole range of impacts. And Northern Ireland, as we all know, it's not built for heat, and we're not built for heat either. And extreme weather. So you will be aware there's been more extreme weather events in the last few years, and we just expect to see a lot more of them in the coming years. So how are we doing in climate change? So this is an area where I think we are catching up with other places. We obviously got the Climate Change Act in 2022. The UK as a whole is aiming for 100% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2050. The UK has reduced as a whole by 44%. We're the lowest of the UK countries at only 20%. We have 3% of the population producing 4% of the emissions. And you can see then where those emissions are coming from. Agriculture, transport, and energy. So those are the areas to focus on. What can we do? There's two different approaches to climate change. There's mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is about reducing the emissions. Adaptation is about making changes to the way we live to cope with climate change. The truth is, we know that we're going to get climate change because it's already built into the system. It's too late to change it all. So this slide then just shows you some of the different things that can be done. So mitigation, you're looking at things like sustainable transport, cleaner energy, energy efficiency. Adaptation actions, you're looking at things like flood protection, infrastructure upgrades. And then in the middle, you've got the things which hit both of those. So clean energy, education, more tree planting, urban forests. And I thought just to finish this section, it'd be worth noting something about the new Climate Change Act. So the Climate Change Act was passed in March 2022. It set a net zero target for emissions by no later than 2050. There's a requirement for climate action plans and carbon budgets for all sectors. There'll be an independent scrutiny and also, very importantly, provision of a just transition. Now, these are important because if we just were to set a target with nothing else, it would be very difficult to judge how we're doing. So it's really important to have these other aspects. Okay, so I'm just going to finish up with a few slides around what does all of this mean for communities. So I suppose, I think that everybody should have the right to access a high quality environment. And the issue that I think we have and our communities have is that a lot of the impacts that we're talking about are going to hit the least able to cope with it the hardest. Poor quality environment impacts the poorest people in our society the most. The same thing goes for climate change. Most of the impacts that we've seen there are going to impact those with the least ability to react. Even if you take something like net zero, and we're all going to be in favor of net zero, but how are we going to actually get to net zero? In order to do that, we need to do a whole range of activities. We need to have more green space, better planning, retrofitting houses, electrification of transport. But it's a massive issue and we haven't even started the conversation. So we need to know how are we going to get to net zero and what's the role for communities and how are communities going to be involved? Are communities prepared? And at the moment, they're not. I think there are some opportunities. I think that in the last few years, you've seen definitely increasing public interest in the environment and in climate. Young people are really engaged, young people are mega engaged in this topic. I think we've also definitely seen improving government policy in the last 5 years in this area. There's definitely increasing international cooperation. This isn't a problem that one country is going to solve by itself, so we need that international cooperation. I think there's lots of opportunities to focus in on practical on-the-ground programs. And I think importantly as well, there's more funding in this area. There's more funding available for environment and climate-related programs. And I suppose the last thing in that, of course, is that we do have local expertise. And I suppose this is my kind of call to action to people in the voluntary sector and in government. We do have expertise in Northern Ireland. Neil has a membership of 70. We can do all kinds of things to help people. We can provide information on environmental issues and educational programs. There's lots of sites that can be visited. So there are things that we can do. And very finally, quick summary about why the SDGs matter. I think the Sustainable Development Goals have loads of potential. They provide a framework for development. They show the connection between environment, economy, and society. They show that economic growth doesn't need to be the priority. I think they're based on equality. And I think, very importantly for the voluntary sector, there's lots of opportunities for us to align.